I recently finished making this new dining table for my parents, and in this video it's about making the table base. It's made from solid beech hardwood and has not a single piece of metal in it. All traditional wooden joinery. So let's get started and I'll show you from start to finish how it all came together. Here is the material for the table base and some more on the shelf. So let's get started milling this down.
From the 3D model I made, I could decide how big the raw pieces should be, so I exclude all the wood defects and get the most out of my material. As I already said in the video of the tabletop, I asked Bosch to help me on this big project with a circular saw together with tracks. For breaking down these big pieces, it was really great and saved me so much time. At this scale it's just better to bring the tool to the piece, and since it's a really powerful saw, it had no problem cutting through all that hardwood at a good speed. Once everything was small enough, I could continue removing the bark and preparing for jointing on the table saw. After inspecting both sides of this slab, I could decide where to cut to make the best use out of it. This circular saw again saves so much time here. What also happens from time to time when working with raw slabs from the sawmill is that it clamps into the riving knife of the saw and I can't continue feeding in any direction. So the thing to do here is to drive a wedge into the existing cut, then it's again no problem.
Here I've now got everything prepared for jointing and planing, everything solid beech hardwood. These two pieces will be the center rail, these two the upper two rails. This will be the upper and lower foot section, all of this the middle foot section, and a little bit of walnut for the two wedges.
Since I have the spiral cutter head in my jointer planer, I can also joint 3mm per pass and get a good surface. That again saves a lot of time, but it's also true that you have to push a bit harder with this cutter head. The really long pieces were also a bit of a challenge, but it worked. Now, since I have to remove some thickness, it would take forever to do all of that with the planer. So I did a lot of that with the bandsaw first. Then I only had to make 1 or 2 passes through the planer for the final thickness.
All pieces are now flat on two faces and almost at final thickness, and I already arranged them in the order that I want to glue them together next.
In the end, these will be the upper and lower parts of the legs. I also saved on clamps here by clamping all pieces at once. It was the same for the middle pieces, except here there were more pieces and a bigger glue surface. After the glue dried, I could cut some pieces in half. By leaving them long at first, I don't have to deal with planer snipe on both ends. I did that with a simple guiding jig for the circular saw and cutting from both sides. By the way, this battery powered saw was actually an awesome gift from a viewer through my Amazon wishlist. Lastly, I prepared the stock for the center rail.
I next need to cut these pieces to exactly the same length, and to achieve that I will clamp them together and cut them at the same time on the tabletop.
But that's easier said than done, because my shop is so narrow, about 2.5 meters, I need to rotate my saw 90 degrees for such cuts. Everything in my shop is arranged for situations like this, but it still takes some setup time. And the actual cutting time is then just 5 minutes.
The first thing to make now is the tapered square hole for the wedge in the center rail. And I really don't think that I am skilled enough to do that in the solid piece with drills and a chisel. So I'm going to cheat. I conveniently need to glue the center rail together out of these two pieces anyways. And that allows me to cut the tapered hole before I glue together. But that also means that these cutouts need to be at exactly the same positions on both ends. So when I glue together, they will line up perfectly. So to make these cutouts, I will use a router and a square to guide one side. And this jig that serves the same purpose as the square, but this will guide the router at the 5-degree angle. This dig represents the distance from the edge to the guide, and this distance here is the offset of the router base. Now I line everything up really carefully. And clamp it down. And now I just do the exact same on all pieces, and always using this as the reference edge for the square. For the angle cut, it's exactly the same procedure, just not the square but the jig.
Here I had to take care that the router base never loses contact to the jig, otherwise I would remove material where I shouldn't. And after the precise cuts, I could remove the leftover material freehand.
Nice and clean with sharp edges. Now just doing that 3 times again. I've clamped both boards together and visually they line up exactly perfect. Here's the other side, and by feeling the seam, it's maybe 5/100th of a millimeter off. I think that is good enough. I've now made 2 dummy wedges, which was actually more hand plane work than I thought. And they should help me to align the pieces perfectly to each other when I glue it together. The last problem with this glue up is I should not get any glue into this wedge joint, so I have to be quite careful when spreading the glue.
So at the nearest centimeter to the joint I didn't apply any glue. And when putting both pieces on top of each other, I used some spacers, which made everything easier.
Wow, this took a lot more clamps than expected. I've now marked the line for the big tenon on the end. To cut this, I'll again use the router with this jig, and unfortunately the regular fence doesn't work because for this special application it doesn't give me the range I need, so I had to make another fence, just a scrap piece of wood screwed to the corner, and at the corner I have enough range.
Because I'm removing so much material here that support the jig, I left a little bit at the end to keep that support, and that could be removed in the end by hand. That worked great, and the router didn't tip a single time.
Now it's exactly the same procedure to cut these cheeks, only they are a lot deeper than these.
I did this in 3 passes, while again leaving the end untouched for support of the router.
Wow, that worked wonderfully. If this needs some chisel work, it's not very much. The big tenon is done. Next is cutting the mortises into the legs, and the leg stock I first need to mill down to final dimensions. The legs will be made out of 3 pieces, 2 on the side and 1 in the middle. This is long enough to be the middle piece for both legs, but I'll keep it as long as it is now because that will make it easier to cut the joinery, which is the big mortises, for the big tenons. Now I've marked where the tenon needs to be, and that looks pretty good.
There's a lot of material to remove, most of that I could do with a Forstner bit. And here you can also see my very effective 3D printed drill press dust collection again.
Now I've jigged up the router, and this fence will right along this edge and precisely guide this cut. And then I can flip the jig around, and then the fence will right along this edge and precisely guide this cut. This will then also ensure that the mortise is perfectly centered in this piece. The other fence just prevents me from moving too far in the wrong direction. I'm at 37.4 millimeters. I need to be at 38.4. So adjusting the fence and route again. Okay, now I'm there, so let's test the fit. It fits, that means I can plunge deeper now.
Squaring the end was then done with chisels and a square guide. And that actually took some time. It wasn't really difficult, I only had to be consistent and don't try to remove too much at once, trying to get it done quicker.
It fits, and I can test it with my dummy wedge. The wedge also works. You see this tiny little gap here, and when I hammer it in more, it closes. Wow, that was a lot of work. Well, let's do it a second time. Alright, both joints fit and work very nicely. That means I can cut this into 2 pieces and go on with gluing together the legs. They will be arranged like this, and there will be a long floating double mortise and tenon joint to glue these pieces together. Oh, and by the way, here are some measurements from the 3D model that I work with. I'll again use the router jig for this, but this time I have both fences set tight against the piece, so nothing can wiggle around, and I'm really precisely guided. Now I've cut a lot of floating tenons and made sure they all fit correctly. And in the dry assembly it looks pretty good.
I wanted all floating tenons to be a little loose because with them being tight it was impossible to dry assemble, just because there were 16 of them. To compensate, I just used enough glue.
Also making sure that it's straight, but that looks good. The next step is to make the legs into their final shape, and I'll do that with template routing, and since this is drying at the moment, I have some time to make the template. I made a 1-to-1 printout of the shape and cut a piece of hardboard to the same size as this printout, gluing that on top and cutting it out. Next I need to smooth out the cut and sand to the line, and I do that with a piece of sandpaper that I double-sided tape to a thin piece of wood. The template is done and the glue of this is also dry. And one thing for sure, building the capital letter H is now off of my to-do list. Now before I go on, there need to be 2 precise cuts, one being from here to here. That needs to be a very precise distance, and then from here to here. This also needs to be an exact distance because that will determine the height of the table. The first cut needs to be 18 centimeters from this surface, but I can't measure that from the blade because there's all this material in the way. So what I did is I set the fence to be exactly 10 centimeters from this side of the blade, not using the scale. Now I can put the blade away and just add 10 centimeters to the measurement and set it up with the fence. For the second cut, I have my stop block. This definitely makes them lighter. Not really. Now I'm making some precision marks for the joinery on these pieces, and that's quite simple now, since the pieces are still fully symmetrical. Also note how the grain direction of this glue up is symmetrical. Now I can make the template as centered as possible and flush with the bottom.
Next I cut out the rough shape on the bandsaw. Then it's just some routing with the flush trim bit.
Now the already cut surfaces guide the flush trim bit, and I can plunge a little deeper. Since we're still not quite through, I will now use a flush trim bit with a top bearing from the other side, but since it's the same again, I won't show this. You get the idea.
As I did the main shaping of the parts all at once, I also created a curve on the center rail. Since I don't own a fancy drawing bow, I improvised with some laminate flooring, clamps and a string. The rest there was just the same template routing.
With the shape done, next is cutting the tenons onto all ends. And this is once again done with the router jig and one fence riding along the front edge.
Not very interesting to watch the same thing 8 times though. What comes next would have been easier before shaping with all the pieces fully symmetrical, but whatever. The final touches on the tenon shoulders I then again did by hand.
Now the middle section of the legs are done. Next come the upper and lower section.
I first milled that stock to final dimensions and again removed the majority of the mortises with the Forstner bit.
I've now again marked the mortise locations, drilled the majority of the material out, and then set up on the workbench so I can just put all the pieces in here. I don't have to clamp them, and then finish the mortises, at least the sides, with the router jig. Okay, first try. Let's see if that fits. seriously, no skill. That was luck, I think. But no matter if luck or skill, it's just so nice when you put this amount of work into something and then it fits just perfect. But I have to do the same thing again. So I got both the legs now finished with the joinery. Next come the two rails that will connect both legs on the top and also support the tabletop.
Cutting this joinery was a lot simpler because everything could be done with the table saw.
That was the easy part. The more difficult part is the dado cuts in the rails, because they need to match the center rails so that everything fits in the end. To achieve that, I centered out these rails relative to each other, and that dado cut needs to start 15 millimeters away from this shoulder. And that's because of the stock thicknesses I used. The best and easiest way to cut this would be again with the table saw, but I don't want to rotate it again. But then I noticed I could just leave my shop door open and let the piece stick out there.
And why didn't I think of this early in the video? I don't know.
So with all the material hogged away, I can test fit it, and that is too tight. I'm not quite there yet. That means I have to raise the blade a little bit and do all the cuts again. Okay, second test fit. Yeah, now that's good.
Then repeating all of that for the other 3 joints.
Next is getting the width of the dado right, and therefore I now just slowly move my fence, which acts as a stop. With a little bit of luck, this maybe already fits perfectly. That's a little too tight. This is really good. Now marking a line, and when I cut away this material exactly to that line, flip the rail around, it will fit flush with this surface. It now sits almost flush, and I can do the final touches by hand with the chisel. Now it sits completely flush. That now means when I turn it around, it should sit flush again. Perfect. Maybe a little overkill to test it with this. Okay, and now all the joinery for this is complete, and I can dry assemble the whole table base. Wow, does this look awesome. Everything came together. Only this big tenon right here is a little too tight. I need to rework that just a hair, but everything else fits great. The last thing I need to make before shaping the pieces is I need some slots in the base pieces to mount the tabletop to the base. I decided on using threaded inserts in the tabletop and slots to allow for wood movement in the base. This slot I finished with the chisel since it's actually quicker than setting up the router. And the slot now fits an M8 socket head bolt together with a washer. And that is way more than enough clearance for wood movement.
Then came the final shaping of all pieces.
It's amazing how just a simple round over can change the whole appearance of a piece. With all the round over, it already looks a lot nicer and is much nicer to the touch. And the next few hours I will spend with sanding. I now got everything sanded to 240 grit and now can glue together the legs. I only have two of my really big clamps, so I can only do one at a time. Doesn't really matter. The key thing here is not to use too much glue because I really don't want to have any big squeeze out now. That was a little more stressful than I thought because the trapped air inside the joint wanted to push this piece back out of the mortise. And yeah, a little unexpected, but that's what the clamps are for. Now that everything is sanded and the leg is glued together, the last thing before finish is to make the actual wedge out of walnut. There's one problem with the wedge because this cut needs to be exactly straight, but because of this part of the shape, I can't do it with the table saw or a hand plane. I could do it with a bandsaw, but that's not good enough for this. So my solution was again to make a template. Here I could make this cut fully straight with the table saw and stop right here and then sand the rest to shape. Now I can do it with template routing and that's it. I make sure to stick the template on the correct side so the router bit is cutting with the grain and leaves a very nice surface. Now the shape is correct, but it's still too wide, and I will make the perfect fit again with the hand plane on the surface. Now after a few more passes with the hand plane, it fits perfectly. And the angle is correct. And now after all that's done, it's time for finish. And I'm using the same oil finish that I also used on the tabletop.
Applying the oil is quite simple. Just brush on a coat that is not too thin, leave it for 15 minutes and wipe off the excess. Then wait one day, sand with a high grit and repeat. I did 3 coats in total. At the end, I removed the tape from the areas that shouldn't get any finish on them, and then I could bring everything upstairs to assemble it. It is indeed quite an awesome feeling to assemble a big piece of furniture that you made by yourself.
And that's the finished table base. What a beautiful, substantial and, in my opinion, nice looking table base. I am more than satisfied with this. Everything, all the joints worked out. There is not a single piece of metal in this whole base, and this wedge just looks awesome. You could only ask why I glued these joints, because I will never be able to get the center rail out again, and the wedges kind of lose a little bit of their function, but only through gluing these rails in place they really add a lot of strength to the whole construction. And why would you ever want to disassemble this again? My parents won't leave this house here. This will always stay in this kitchen, so yeah, it's okay that it's now one piece. The last thing missing, of course, is the tabletop, and that's a video on its own, which you can watch by clicking the link in the video description or the link at the end of this video. It's really worth it. It's an awesome tabletop. Now let's install this.
With the tabletop set in place, I then just had to find the screw positions or the threaded inserts and screw it in place. And then it was finished.
Next is making the mortise into the middle leg pieces. And the lumber for that, for the legs, is here, which needs to be milled down to final dimensions first. The big tenon is done. Next is cutting the mortise into the... Well, that was the easy part. For the cuts in these rails, that is a bit more difficult. That was the easy part. The cuts, the dados, that was the easy part. The dado cuts in the rails are a little bit more doesn't really matter. The key thing here is not to use too much glue, because I really don't want to have any big squeeze out now. Just get it.